The silence in the tiny apartment was heavier than any sound. For Ilara, 38, it was a constant, suffocating presence, a ghost of the life snatched away. A chilling draught snaked through the ill-fitting window frame, carrying the scent of rain and urban despair. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands resting on the cold, silent surface of her sewing machine. Her fingers, usually nimble and sure, felt clumsy, the tools of a trade that could no longer feed her children. A deep, gnawing ache radiated from the pit of her stomach, a hunger she'd ignored for 2 days. She felt exhaustion seep into her marrow, a leaden weight that made breathing a chore. The long illness that took her husband had also devoured their savings, piece by painful piece, until nothing was left but this hollowed-out existence. She closed her eyes, and the darkness behind her lids was a welcome, temporary relief from the crushing reality. This was a bleak quiet, not of peace, but of finality. A world without his laugh, his warmth. She felt a profound coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chilling emptiness of being utterly alone, adrift in a sea of misery, with 2 small children clinging to her for survival, and she was sinking fast, the water already at her neck. The eviction notice lay on the table, a stark white rectangle against the dark wood. The bold, red letters of the word "Final" seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Ilara's fingers traced the crinkled edges of the paper, worn soft from her rereading the same unforgiving sentences, hoping the words might somehow change. They never did. The legal jargon was a cold, impenetrable wall, but the date at the bottom was brutally clear, a deadline hanging over their heads like a guillotine. 3 days. In 3 days, a sheriff would be at their door. Beside the notice lay her entire world, reduced to a small and pathetic pile. She carefully counted the worn bills and scattered coins for the 10th time. $150. The number was a punch to the gut. She felt the bile rise in her throat, a sickening wave of nausea that was part hunger, part terror. The clink of the quarters and dimes sounded like a funeral dirge. This wasn't enough to stop the eviction. It wasn't enough to find a new place. It was barely enough to feed her children for another week. It was the sound of absolute failure. The money, a mix of faded paper and cold metal, felt like ashes in her hand, the last remnants of a life that had been burned to the ground, leaving her and her children exposed to the coming storm. From the other room, a small, dry cough broke the silence. Mia, her daughter, was only 7, too young to understand the precipice on which they stood, yet her small body seemed to carry their hardship. Ilara's heart clenched with a familiar, sharp pain. Leo, at 11, understood more. He sat on the floor, pretending to read a book, but his eyes, wide and fearful, kept flicking from the eviction notice to his mother's face. He was trying so hard to be the man of the house, a role cruelly thrust upon him, but she could see the boyish terror he fought to conceal. "I'm not hungry, Mom," he had lied an hour earlier, his voice trying for a strength it didn't possess. The lie was a small, sharp knife in her soul. She walked silently to the small bedroom, the floorboards groaning under her feet. Mia was curled under a thin blanket, her breathing shallow. Ilara placed a hand on her daughter's forehead. It felt cool but also clammy, a telltale sign of a body running on empty. A wave of protective fury and profound failure washed over Ilara. These were her children, her responsibility, and she was failing them in the most fundamental way. They were cold, hungry, and soon they would be homeless. The weight of it was a physical pressure on her chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. Ilara moved through the cramped apartment like a phantom, her feet making no sound on the worn linoleum. The few cardboard boxes, half-packed with their meager collection of worn clothes and chipped dishes, were monuments to her failure. The air was thick with the scent of dampness and dust, a smell she now associated with poverty. She ran a hand over a faded photograph on the wall, one of the last things she hadn't packed. It showed her and her husband years ago, smiling on a sunny day. The memory was so vivid it hurt. She could almost hear his deep laughter, feel the warmth of his arm around her. But the apartment was deafeningly silent. Now, the only sounds were the drip, drip, drip of a leaky faucet in the kitchen sink, a maddeningly steady rhythm marking the seconds until their world collapsed. She felt a terrifying isolation, a feeling of being completely cut off. There was no family left to call, no one to turn to for a loan or a place to stay. They were an island, and the tide was rising, A single, hot tear, a traitor she thought she had no more of, escaped and carved a cold track through the grime on her cheek. It didn't feel like a release. It felt like a final admission of defeat. There was no hope here, only the slow, agonizing end of everything. The city lights, usually a comfort, cast long, distorted shadows across the room that writhed and twisted like her own anxieties. Ilara huddled in a threadbare armchair, the only piece of furniture not destined for a box or the curb, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to ward off the chill. But this was a cold that blankets couldn't touch. It was a bone-deep rigor of pure fear that had taken root in her soul. The $150 on the table was a cruel joke, not a lifeline, but a weight dragging them down faster. It was just enough to give the illusion of choice where none existed. Her thoughts spiraled, a vortex of terrifying images. Leo's face, pinched with hunger, Mia's small hand shivering in her own as they slept on a cold sidewalk, the predatory glances of strangers. A wave of vertigo washed over her. Her stomach lurched, and for a moment she thought she would be sick. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images were burned onto the inside of her eyelids. This was it, a dead end, a final, locked door with no key. There was no way forward and no way back. What would you do if you were in her place? With every path seemingly blocked. If you enjoy stories of survival against all odds, be sure to subscribe for more tales of mystery and resilience. The jarring ring of the telephone sliced through the oppressive silence, making Ilara jump. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Who would be calling her? The sound was alien, a relic from a life where people still reached out. She wiped her clammy hands on her jeans and answered. Her voice a dry whisper. A man's voice, crisp and impersonal, introduced himself as a lawyer. He spoke of legal statutes and probate court, words that felt distant and meaningless. She felt a familiar wave of confusion and suspicion wash over her. Was this another bill collector? A new kind of predator she hadn't yet encountered? He spoke of a last will and testament, of a great aunt she never knew existed, a name that was just a collection of unfamiliar sounds. Ilara held her breath, the receiver slick with sweat in her palm. Her mind, so accustomed to bad news, struggled to process the possibility of anything else. It felt like a trap, a cruel trick of the universe dangling a thread of hope just to snatch it away. The lawyer continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. Your great-aunt, a Miss Seraphina Vance, has passed. She has named you, Ilara Vance, as the sole inheritor of her estate. Ilara felt a dizzying vertigo, her hand gripping the edge of the kitchen table to steady herself. Estate. The word sounded so grand, so disconnected from the grim reality surrounding her. She pictured mansions and bank accounts, a fantasy that died as soon as it was born. She felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat but choked it down. The lawyer quickly clarified. The estate consisted of a single asset, the old family house, and the small plot of land it sat on. In a rural county she'd only seen on a map. There was no money, just the property, the flicker of hope, so bright and blinding for a moment, dimmed to a weak ember. It wasn't salvation, it was a building. Still, it was a roof. It was 4 walls. A desperate, clawing hope, different from the fantasy, began to take root in the barren soil of her despair. It wasn't a choice. It was the only alternative to the street. The bus tickets cost $87. The transaction left her with a little over $60 to her name, a sum that felt both laughably small and terrifyingly final. The crisp bills, passed to a bored-looking clerk, were the last tangible link to her old life. She felt her stomach twist into a tight, painful knot as she pocketed the change and the flimsy paper tickets. This was it, a one-way trip into the unknown, a gamble made not with chips, but with the lives of her children. Leo, holding Mia's hand, watched her with an unreadable expression. His young face aged with a solemnity that broke her heart. He didn't ask questions. He just trusted her. The weight of that trust was immense, a physical pressure on her shoulders. As they boarded the rumbling bus, the scent of diesel fuel and old vinyl filling her nostrils, Ilara felt a surge of pure, primal fear. She was leading them away from the only home they'd ever known, into a future based on the name of a dead stranger and a lawyer's dispassionate voice. The hope was a fragile, glass-like thing in her chest. She feared the slightest jolt would shatter it. The journey was a long, shuddering crawl out of the city's grey embrace. The bus groaned and rattled, every bump in the road a jarring reminder of their precarious situation. Ilara watched the familiar landscape of concrete and steel bleed into sprawling suburbs, then finally dissolve into the vast, monotonous green and brown of the countryside. The world outside the grimy window felt alien and immense. She felt a growing sense of isolation with every passing mile marker. Mia had fallen into a restless sleep, her small head heavy on Ilara's arm, her breath fogging the cold glass of the window. Leo sat bolt upright, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his hands clenched in his lap. He was a silent sentinel, guarding against a threat he couldn't name. Ilara's own thoughts were a chaotic storm. The image of the house, a place she had never seen, became her sole focus. She built it up in her mind. A sturdy, humble cottage. It had to be. She felt her sanity cling to that manufactured image, that desperate fantasy of a safe harbor at the end of this grueling voyage. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting angle of the sun. The air inside the bus grew stale and warm, thick with the smell of other people's lunches and the low hum of conversation. Ilara felt a deep ache in her bones, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of constant, unrelenting stress. Her mind kept replaying the last few days, a highlight reel of failure and fear, the eviction notice, the dwindling pile of coins, the hunger in her children's eyes. This journey felt less like a new beginning and more like a flight. They were refugees, cast out from their own lives. She stroked Mia's hair, the fine strands soft against her rough, calloused fingers. A wave of fierce, desperate love washed over her, so powerful it was painful. She had to make this work. There was no other option. The hope she harbored was no longer a gentle warmth. It was a frantic, burning fire in her gut, fueled by sheer maternal terror. Failure was not a possibility she could afford to entertain. The thought alone made nausea climb her throat. The bus hissed to a stop in a cloud of diesel smoke, the sound deafening after the monotonous drone of the engine. "End of the line," the driver grunted, not bothering to look back. They were on the side of a deserted two-lane road, flanked by dense, overgrown woods on one side and an endless expanse of parched farmland on the other. The bus pulled away, its red taillights shrinking in the distance until they vanished, leaving behind a profound and unnerving silence. The only sound was the chirping of unseen insects and the whisper of a hot, dry wind rustling through the tall grass. A thick, oppressive humidity descended upon them, sticking their clothes to their skin. Ilara felt a sudden, sharp spike of panic. They were utterly alone. The lawyer's directions indicated a half-mile walk down a dirt path just ahead. She looked at her children. Mia was blinking in the harsh afternoon light, while Leo's face was pale, his eyes wide as he scanned the empty road. Her heart clenched. She had brought them to the middle of nowhere. The isolation was a palpable thing, a vast empty space that swallowed the sound of their breathing. The dirt path was more of a suggestion than a road, two faint ruts disappearing into a tunnel of gnarled, overhanging trees, carrying their single, heavy suitcase while Mia clung to her other hand. Ilara pushed forward. The air under the canopy of leaves was still and suffocating, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Thorns from overgrown briars snagged at their clothes, and the constant buzz of mosquitoes was a maddening presence around their heads. Her arms ached, and sweat dripped into her eyes, stinging them. Every step felt like a monumental effort. This wasn't the quaint country lane she had pictured. This was a hostile, forgotten track. After what felt like an eternity, the trees thinned, and she saw it. Set back from the path in a clearing of weeds was a dark, hulking shape against the bruised twilight sky. The house. For a single, fleeting moment, her heart leaped with relief. It was real. It was there. But as they drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a nightmarish reality, and the fragile hope in her chest began to crack and splinter. It wasn't a house. It was a skeleton, a dilapidated two-story structure, its wood siding weathered to a leprous grey, peeling away in long strips to expose the rotting timbers beneath. A significant portion of the roof on the right side had completely collapsed inward, leaving a gaping black hole open to the elements. The porch sagged dramatically to one side, its steps splintered and broken, looking as if a single touch would reduce them to dust. Most of the windows were shattered, the remaining shards of glass glinting like broken teeth in the dying light. Wild, thorny vines crawled up the walls, coiling around the porch columns and reaching into the empty window frames like skeletal fingers. The air itself seemed to change as they approached, growing heavy with a foul, pervasive odor. It was the smell of a place long dead, a sickening miasma of rot, standing water and deep, ancient mold. Ilara stopped dead in her tracks, the suitcase dropping from her numb fingers and landing with a dull thud in the dirt. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a shelter, it was a grave. "Mom?" Leo's voice was a small, trembling thing, stripped of his forced bravery. "Is this it?" He couldn't keep the horror from his tone. Ilara couldn't answer. She could only stare, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were seeing. The vibrant, hopeful picture she had so carefully constructed in her mind, shattered into a million pieces, replaced by this monument of decay. It was worse than the apartment. It was worse than the street. The street at least had other people, the possibility of help. This was absolute isolation, a crumbling prison in the middle of nowhere. Despair, thick and black as tar, rose up and choked her. It was a physical sensation, a crushing weight on her chest that made it impossible to breathe. The hope she had clung to so fiercely was revealed for what it was, a cruel, elaborate lie. She had spent their last dollar chasing a ghost, dragging her children into a ruin at the edge of the world. A wave of nausea, sharp and acidic, surged up her throat. This was the bottom. She had been so sure she was already there, but she had been wrong. This was the true, unforgiving abyss. She forced her legs to move, a step at a time, circling the decrepit structure as if investigating a crime scene. Every detail was a fresh blow. The foundation was cracked, with thick, ugly weeds forcing their way through the stone. A rain barrel, rusted through and overflowing with slimy black water, sat under a broken gutter, breeding a cloud of buzzing insects. Around the back, a chimney had partially crumbled, spilling a cascade of bricks onto the ground below. The paint, where it remained, was blistered and flaking like the skin of a burn victim. She reached out and touched the siding. The wood was soft and spongy under her fingertips, disintegrating with the slightest pressure. It felt like diseased flesh. A colder, hard certainty settled in her gut. The house wasn't just abandoned. It was actively dying, surrendering to the slow, relentless assault of time and neglect. It was unsafe, a death trap. The very idea of bringing her children inside this collapsing shell felt like a profound betrayal of her most basic duty as a mother. A sob, hot and painful, caught in her throat. The front door hung crookedly on a single, groaning hinge. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm her racing heart, Ilara gave it a push. It shrieked in protest, the sound of metal scraping against metal echoing in the unnerving quiet of the evening. The door swung inward into a maw of absolute darkness. The stench that rolled out was overpowering, a physical force that made her gag and recoil. It was the smell of a century of dust, of pervasive dampness, of rat droppings, and the musty, sweet scent of decay. It was the smell of things that had been sealed away and left to rot. She stood frozen on the threshold, her body refusing to cross into that suffocating blackness. She felt a primal, instinctual fear, the kind that warns of predators in the dark. This place felt malevolent, hostile. It wasn't just empty. It felt occupied by the sheer weight of its own neglect. The silence from within was not peaceful. It was heavy, expectant, like the held breath of something waiting. A shiver, completely unrelated to the evening chill, traced a cold path down her spine. Her phone. She fumbled in her pocket, her fingers clumsy with dread. The screen glowed to life, showing a dangerously low battery. Then she switched on the flashlight. The thin, weak beam cut a nervous path through the gloom of what must have been the living room, and what it revealed made her stomach clench. The light played over furniture shrouded in thick, cobweb-draped sheets, making them look like a gathering of silent, hunched figures. Water stains, dark and sprawling like monstrous continents, mapped the walls and ceiling, marking the slow, steady invasion of the rain. The floorboards were warped and uneven, and in the corner a pile of sodden plaster had fallen from the ceiling, exposing the dark, skeletal laths above. Then, a sudden movement in the beam's periphery. A large rat, sleek and dark, scurried from behind a shrouded armchair, its claws making a dry, scratching sound on the dusty floor before it vanished into a hole in the wall. Mia let out a small, terrified gasp behind her. Ilara felt a wave of revulsion and utter despair. This wasn't a home, it was an infestation. Stepping cautiously over the warped threshold, the floor groaning ominously under her slight weight, she swept the phone's light into the adjoining room. The kitchen. It was a scene of unparalleled squalor. The countertops were coated in a thick, greasy layer of grime. The cabinet doors hung open at odd angles, revealing empty, spider-webbed shelves. A rusted, cast-iron stove stood like a monument to a forgotten era, its surface flaking away. She saw a hand pump attached to the sink and pushed the handle. It moved with a dry, squealing protest, but no water came out, only a puff of rust-colored dust. She flicked a light switch on the wall out of pure, desperate habit. Nothing, of course. No power, no water, no safety. The reality of their situation crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow. They were stranded in a decaying shell, with no resources and no way to contact the outside world once her phone battery died. She felt utterly, completely trapped. The last ember of her desperate hope was finally, brutally extinguished, leaving only the cold, dark ash of reality. Mia's composure finally broke. A thin, frightened wail escaped her lips, quickly turning into gulping, terrified sobs. "I want to go home, Mommy," she cried, burying her face in Ilara's leg. The word home was a dagger in Ilara's heart. They had no home. She looked at Leo. He stood stiffly beside her, his face a pale, stoic mask, but she could see the silent tears tracking paths through the grime on his cheeks. He was trying to be strong for her, for his sister, and the sight of his silent suffering was more devastating than any scream. A ferocious, protective anger surged through Ilara, anger at the faceless lawyer, at the dead great-aunt, at her own foolish as desperate hope. But the rage was instantly smothered by a tidal wave of crushing self-loathing and helplessness. She had done this. She had led them here. She had promised them a haven and delivered them to a nightmare. The weight of her failure was absolute, a black hole of despair that threatened to swallow her whole. Her knees felt weak, her entire body trembling with the shock of it all. Ilara sank to her knees on the rotting porch, the splintered wood digging painfully into her skin. She pulled Mia into a fierce, desperate hug, resting her cheek on her daughter's trembling head as Leo knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around them both. They huddled together, a tiny, isolated island of warmth and terror in the face of this vast, cold ruin. The sun had completely set, plunging the world into a deep, rural darkness pierced only by the cold, distant light of the stars. The oppressive silence of the countryside closed in around them, broken only by Mia's heart-wrenching sobs. There was nowhere to go. They had no money for a bus ticket back, and nowhere to go back to anyway. There was no one to call. This was it. The end of the line. A dry, racking sob, devoid of tears, tore itself from Ilara's throat. It was a sound of pure, animalistic despair, the sound of a spirit breaking. She had lost everything. Her husband, her home, her savings, and now, finally, her hope. She was adrift in the abyss, and she had dragged her children down with her. The first night in the ruin was a waking nightmare. They huddled together on the dusty floor of the least damaged room, wrapped in the few blankets they owned, while the wind moaned through the shattered windows like a grieving spirit. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the decaying house, every rustle in the walls, sent a fresh jolt of terror through Ilara. She felt the gnawing emptiness of hunger in her stomach, a pain she could ignore, but knew her children could not. As dawn broke, casting a weak grey light through the grime-caked windows, a cold resolve settled over her. Despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. Action was the only antidote. If this was to be their shelter, even for a day, she had to fight the decay. She had to create a pocket of safety, however small. She felt a grim determination replace the raw panic. It was a choice between succumbing to the darkness or lighting a single, defiant candle. She would not let this house, this grave, be the end of their story. She would clean. She would work. It was all she knew how to do. She started in the main living room, the one that had first filled her with such profound dread. Her first task was to conquer the oppressive darkness. Using the sleeve of her worn jacket, she began to wipe away the decades of grime from a large window pane that was miraculously intact. The friction of the cloth against the glass was a satisfyingly real sound in the heavy silence. As the dirt came away in thick, dark streaks, a rectangle of pale morning light pierced the gloom. It wasn't much, but it felt like a victory. The light illuminated the swirling dust motes in the air, a galaxy of tiny particles dancing in the beam. It also revealed the full extent of the squalor, the thick, velvety layers of dust coating every surface, the intricate, abandoned architecture of spiderwebs. The smell of dust and damp was thick in her nostrils, but with the light, the room transformed from a tomb into something merely abandoned. It was a small shift, but for Ilara, whose heart was starved for any sliver of hope, it was everything. She felt the knot of terror in her chest loosen, just a fraction. Leo, seeing his mother's resolve, silently joined her. He found an old rag and began to methodically wipe down the surface of a large, shrouded table, his movements serious and focused. Mia, too young to help but unwilling to be left alone, sat on the cleanest patch of floor Ilara had cleared, her small legs tucked beneath her. She was quiet, her wide eyes tracking the dust clouds their cleaning stirred up. The shared, silent work created a new kind of quiet in the room. It was no longer the silence of despair, but the quiet of purpose. The scrape of rags, the grunt of effort as Ilara moved a shrouded chair, the soft thud of a book being moved from a dusty shelf. These small sounds pushed back against the oppressive emptiness. Ilara felt a flicker of her old self return, the woman who could mend and fix, who could bring order from chaos with her own two hands. Her muscles began to ache with the unaccustomed labor, a clean, honest pain that felt infinitely better than the paralyzing ache of fear. They were not just cleaning a room, they were reclaiming a tiny piece of their stolen dignity. It was Mia who broke the working silence. "Mommy, look," she said, her voice small but clear. She was pointing a tiny, dust-smudged finger towards the wall above the enormous, crumbling fireplace. "The picture is crooked." Ilara followed her gaze. There, shrouded in shadow and cobwebs, hung a large, dark painting in a heavy, ornate frame. It was massive, at least 4 feet tall, and tilted at a drunken angle, as if it had given up on hanging straight long ago. It was so coated in a thick, uniform layer of blackish grime that it looked less like a painting and more like a void, a patch of solid darkness on the wall. Ilara had barely noticed it, dismissing it as another piece of junk in a house full of it. "It's just old trash, sweetie," she said, her voice tired. But Mia was insistent. "It's sad," she whispered. The simple, childish observation struck a strange chord in Ilara. Sad. The whole house was sad. Perhaps it was time to take some of the sadness down. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to remove it, to get that rectangle of blackness off the wall. Getting the painting down was a challenge. Ilara dragged over a rickety-looking wooden chair, testing it with her weight before cautiously climbing on. The chair groaned in protest, its joints creaking, and for a moment she felt a spike of fear that she would fall and break a bone, a disaster they could not possibly withstand. Her fingers, reaching for the top of the frame, sank into a thick, spongy layer of dust and cobwebs. A shiver of revulsion ran down her spine. The painting was heavy, far heavier than she expected, and she had to brace her feet on the chair as she lifted it from the large, rusted hook. A cloud of dust and the dry husks of ancient insects rained down on her, making her cough and squeeze her eyes shut. She felt the grime coat her face and hair. The scent was acrid, the smell of time itself decaying. With a final grunt of effort, she wrestled the heavy object off the wall and stumbled back, nearly losing her balance before carefully lowering it to lean against the fireplace hearth. The wall behind it was starkly lighter, a clean rectangle in the middle of the filth, a ghost of the painting's presence. She stood back, breathing heavily, her hands and arms coated in a black film. Her first instinct was to drag the monstrosity outside and leave it to rot in the weeds. It was ugly, oppressive, and felt like a concentration of all the house's gloom. But then, a flicker of something else, a stubborn curiosity, took hold. What was underneath all that filth? What had someone, generations ago, thought was important enough to hang in such a prominent place? She found the rag Leo had been using, now damp from her attempts to clean the window. Kneeling on the dusty floor, she felt a strange sense of purpose, as if she were an archaeologist about to excavate a lost relic. She started on one of the bottom corners, where the frame was chipped. With a firm, circular motion, she began to wipe. The grime was thick and resistant, like a layer of tar. It took several passes, each one smearing the dirt before finally lifting it. Slowly, painstakingly, a small patch of color began to emerge from the blackness. First, a hint of deep blue, then a sliver of ivory. She worked with a new intensity, her breath held in her throat. The small patch of color grew. The ivory resolved itself into the delicate lace collar of a dress. The deep blue became the rich velvet of the garment itself. She wiped higher, her movements becoming more frantic. The curve of a neck appeared, then the soft line of a chin. She felt her heart begin to beat faster, a strange premonition prickling at the back of her neck. The phone in her pocket was nearly dead, but she pulled it out and turned on its weak flashlight, shining the beam directly on the area she was cleaning. Under the focused light, the details sprang to life, rendered in the rich, deep oils of a master painter. She scrubbed at the face, and as the final layer of grime dissolved, a woman's features emerged from the darkness of the past, and Ilara gasped. A wave of vertigo washed over her, so intense she had to put a hand on the floor to steady herself. The phone slipped from her trembling fingers, its beam now casting erratic shadows across the room. It was her. It was her own face staring back at her from the canvas, the shape of the eyes, the high cheekbones, the curve of the lips, the slight widow's peak at the hairline. It was an absolutely perfect and uncanny replica of her own reflection. The resemblance was not just close, it was exact, as if the artist had painted her portrait just yesterday, not in this 19th century style with the severe swept-up hair and the formal high-collared dress. A cold dread mingled with profound confusion seeped into her bones. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. It was a coincidence, a trick of the light, a figment of her stressed and exhausted imagination, but she knew, with a chilling certainty that defied all logic, that it was none of those things. She picked up the phone, her hand shaking so badly she could barely hold the light steady, and shone it back on the painting, then on her own face, her reflection captured in a shard of broken mirror nearby. The woman on the canvas and the woman in the mirror were identical. It was impossible. It was terrifying, and it was real. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Who was this woman, this ghost with her face? She forced herself to breathe, to push past the initial wave of shock and study the portrait with a forensic intensity. The woman, her doppelganger, was painted with a somber, almost melancholic expression. Her eyes, so eerily familiar, seemed to hold a deep, ancient sadness. They stared out from the canvas not at the viewer, but slightly past them, as if focused on a distant, painful memory. The artist had captured a profound sense of isolation in her gaze. It was a look Ilara knew intimately. She had seen it in her own reflection for months. This woman, this stranger from another century, felt a kinship with her that transcended time. Her gaze dropped from the woman's face to the details of her dress. Around her neck, painted with exquisite, shimmering detail, was a unique silver locket. It was oval-shaped, with an intricate design of swirling vines etched into its surface. It hung from a delicate chain, resting right at the hollow of the woman's throat. The locket. The painting was a mystery, but the locket felt like a clue. Ilara felt an inexplicable pull towards it, a strange, powerful intuition that hummed beneath her skin. It was more than just a detail in a painting. It felt like a key. Her eyes darted from the painted locket to the fireplace, the place where the painting had hung for so long. The logic was insane, a leap of faith born from desperation and shock, but it was all she had. The painting hung there, directly above the hearth. The woman in the painting wore a locket. Her gaze scanned the crumbling brickwork of the fireplace, searching for anything out of the ordinary. The structure was a mess of soot, cracks, and missing mortar. It seemed a hopeless task. Her fingers, still dirty, traced the rough lines of the bricks directly below where the hook had been. She pushed and prodded at them, one by one. They were all firm, solidly mortared in place. Her flicker of intuition began to feel foolish. It was a crumbling fireplace, nothing more. A wave of disappointment washed over her, sharp and bitter. But she didn't stop. The feeling, the hunch, was too strong to ignore. It was a voice in the back of her mind, urging her on. She moved lower, to the hearth itself, a wide, flat ledge of darker stone. She ran her hands over its surface, feeling the grit and cold beneath her palms, and then her fingers brushed against something that was not quite right. A single brick, set into the hearth right at its center, had a slightly different texture. Its edges were not as sharp, its surface smoother. It looked identical to the others, but it felt different. Her breath caught in her throat. She pressed on it. Nothing. She tried to slide it. It wouldn't budge. Frustration gnawed at her. Using her fingernails, she began to frantically scrape at the crumbling mortar around its edges. The old material flaked away easily, crumbling into a fine and grey dust that smelled of soot and age. She dug and scraped, ignoring the pain as the rough brick tore at her cuticles. Her desperation giving her a strength she didn't know she possessed. A small crack of darkness appeared along one edge. The brick was loose. Her heart gave a powerful thud. Using the tips of her fingers, she pried at the edge of the brick. It resisted. Then, with a dry, scraping sound of stone against stone, it tilted upwards. It wasn't mortared in at all. It had been carefully fitted into place. With her heart pounding in her ears, she lifted the brick out. It was heavy, solid. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity, a perfectly carved-out space no bigger than her hand. It was a secret compartment, hidden in plain sight for who knew how many years. The air that rose from the opening was cool and smelled of nothing, a pocket of time perfectly sealed away from the decay of the house. For a moment, she just stared into the small, black void, a sense of awe and terror warring within her. What could be in there? What secret was so important that it needed to be hidden so completely? She reached a trembling hand into the darkness, her fingers brushing against something small, solid, and cold. It was metal. With a surge of adrenaline, she closed her hand around it and pulled it out into the light. It lay in her palm, cool and heavy, a startling weight of reality, a tarnished silver locket. It was oval-shaped, its surface so blackened with age that the design was almost invisible. But as she rubbed a thumb across it, the grime came away and her breath hitched. There, revealed beneath the tarnish, was an intricate pattern of swirling vines. It was identical. It was the exact locket from the painting. The impossible connection sent a shiver down her entire body. This was not a coincidence. This was a message, sent across a chasm of more than 100 years, and she was the one who had just received it. The locket felt ancient, imbued with the weight of the secrets it held. It wasn't designed to be opened easily. There was no visible clasp, only a thin, almost invisible seam running around its edge. She worked at it with her ragged fingernail, her hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and dread. With a faint, metallic click that sounded deafening in the silent room, the locket sprang open. Ilara braced herself, expecting to see a miniature portrait, perhaps of a husband or a child. But it held no picture. Instead, nestled within the two velvet-lined halves, was a small, tightly folded piece of parchment, yellowed and brittle with age. It looked so fragile she was almost afraid to touch it, fearing it would crumble to dust. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel the pulse in her temples. This was it. This was the secret. With the utmost care, using the very tips of her fingers, she lifted the tiny packet out. It rustled with a dry, whispering sound as she unfolded it. The paper was covered in a tight, spidery script. The ink faded from black to a rusty brown, but still perfectly legible. It was a letter. As her eyes scanned the first few lines, the words seemed to leap off the page, and the air was punched from her lungs. This was no simple letter. It was a confession. I, Alistair Croft, write this in a state of mortal sin, it began, haunted by the ghost of my cousin, the true heiress, Lyanna. Lyanna. The woman in the painting had a name, Ilara's great-great-grandmother. The letter was a torrent of horrifying revelation. Alistair, a jealous cousin, wrote of his unholy ambition and his plot to steal Lyanna's vast inheritance, a fortune built from sprawling coffee plantations. He confessed to conspiring with a doctor, paying him to have the perfectly sane Lyanna declared mentally unstable, a hysterical woman, unfit to manage her own affairs, he wrote of finding a destitute woman in the city, a woman who bore a shocking and fortuitous resemblance to his cousin. He had paid this impostor to take Liana's place, marrying her to legitimize his claim and seize control of the entire family fortune. The painting, he wrote, was a final ironic cruelty, a portrait of the fake wife, a trophy of his victory hanging in the true heiress's home. Ilara felt a wave of nausea. The woman in the painting wasn't her ancestor. She was a fraud, a paid duplicate. And as Ilara's eyes fell to the last chilling lines of the confession, the full horror of the secret finally broke over her. The impostor had taken Liana's name and her life, but what had happened to the real Liana? The confession provided the brutal answer. "To ensure my claim was never challenged," Alistair had written, his script growing more frantic and jagged. The real Liana had to be silenced forever. She was taken from the asylum on a moonless night. Her final resting place is a quiet one, where she can cause no more trouble. He spoke of a secret burial, a final act of betrayal to secure his stolen legacy. Ilara felt the cold certainty of the truth settle in her soul, a truth far darker than she could have imagined. Her ancestor hadn't just been cheated, she had been murdered. Her entire existence had been erased, replaced by a lie that had been passed down through generations. A profound sense of injustice, cold and sharp, pierced through Ilara's shock. This wasn't just a story, it was her story. It was a crime committed against her own blood, and the evidence was right here in her trembling hands. Tucked into the final fold of the parchment was a second, smaller piece of paper. It was a map, drawn with the same faded ink as the confession. It was a crude but detailed rendering of the property, this very house marked clearly in the center. The surrounding woods were sketched in, along with the dirt path she had walked down, and on the edge of the property, deep in the woods to the north of the house, was a single large tree, marked with a stark X-E. Beside it, 2 words were written in the same spidery hand: Betrayer's Oak. Ilara's blood ran cold. It was a grave marker, the final, damning piece of the puzzle. Alistair had not only confessed his crime, but had also provided the exact location of his victim's body. He had buried her on her own land, a final, grotesque insult. The confession and the map were not just historical documents, they were evidence of a murder, a cold case over a century old, the secret hidden just feet from where she now knelt. Her mind struggled to process the sheer scale of the deception, the poverty, the ruin. This dilapidated house, it was all a consequence of this single ancient crime. The fortune that should have been hers, that should have provided a safety net for her and her children, had been stolen by a murderer named Alistair Croft. She looked from the confession in her hand to the painting of the impostor, whose sad eyes now seemed mocking. She looked around at the decaying room, at the water stains and the crumbling plaster. This ruin wasn't a sad accident of time, it was the direct result of a monstrous betrayal. A fire began to smolder in the pit of her stomach, a feeling she had not felt in a very long time: rage. It was a clean, righteous fury that burned away the last vestiges of her despair. This was more than just a house now. This land, this ruin, was a crime scene, and the ghost of Liana, her true ancestor, was not just a face in a painting, but a victim crying out for justice across the silent decades. She carefully folded the confession and the map, her hands no longer trembling, but steady with a newfound, dangerous purpose. She slipped the fragile parchment back into the tarnished silver locket and felt its cold weight in her palm. It was no longer just a piece of old jewelry. It was a weapon. It was proof. It was the key to unraveling a century of lies. The despair that had crushed her upon arriving at this ruin was gone, replaced by a singular, electrifying focus. The house was no longer a symbol of her failure, but the epicenter of a profound mystery that was intrinsically tied to her own blood. She had come here seeking shelter, a place to hide from the world. Instead, she had stumbled into a story of theft and murder, a story that was demanding to be finished. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a fierce, protective resolve. She had to know what happened. She had to find the betrayer's oak. She had to bring justice for Liana. The weight of the locket in her pocket was a constant, physical reminder of the secret she now carried. The world had shifted on its axis. Just hours ago, her biggest problem was finding food and shelter for the night. Now, she was the sole keeper of a truth that could potentially dismantle a legacy built on a lie. She looked over at her children. Leo was still diligently wiping down a dusty windowsill, and Mia was now quietly tracing patterns in the thick dust on the floor. They were so innocent, so unaware of the dark history that saturated the very air they were breathing. A wave of protective ferocity washed over her. This wasn't just about justice for a long-dead ancestor anymore. This was about their future. If Alistair Croft had stolen a fortune, what had happened to it? Who had it now? The name Croft echoed in her mind, no longer just a name from a confession, but a target. The mystery had opened a door, and though she was terrified of what lay on the other side, she knew she had no choice but to walk through it. She stood up, her body aching from the work and the tension, but her spirit felt strangely energized. The living room, illuminated by the single clean window, no longer felt as threatening. The shrouded furniture seemed less like specters and more like silent witnesses. The house itself felt different, as if it had been holding its breath for 100 years and had finally exhaled, revealing its secret to the one person who could understand. She felt a profound connection to the woman named Liana, a kinship that was more than just a shared face. It was a shared legacy of loss, a shared sense of injustice. Ilara was no longer just a destitute widow running from eviction. She was a descendant, an heiress, and now an investigator. The path forward was no longer an endless, dark tunnel of despair. It was a trail, marked by a confession and a map, leading into a dark and dangerous mystery. And for the first time in a long time, Ilara felt a spark not of desperate hope, but of genuine power. She walked over to the painting of the imposter and looked at it again. The woman's sad eyes seemed to hold a different meaning now. Was it guilt, or was it just the face of another victim? A poor woman used as a pawn in a rich man's game. The questions swirled in Ilara's mind, each one a thread in a complex, tangled web. Who was Alistair Croft? Did he have descendants? Could they still be in the area? The name felt significant, powerful. She had a feeling this was not a story that had ended with Alistair's death. The consequences of his crime were still echoing, and she and her children were living inside that echo. She felt a chill as she realized the potential danger. Unearthing a secret that had been buried for so long, a secret that involved a stolen fortune, was not a safe endeavor. But the thought of turning back, of ignoring what she had found, was impossible. It would be a betrayal of Liana, and a betrayal of herself. She took a deep breath, the dusty air filling her lungs. The first step was to learn more. The name, Alistair Croft, was her only lead. In a town this small and isolated, a name like that, especially one tied to a fortune from coffee plantations, would likely have left a mark. There had to be records, a local library, a historical society, something. Her phone was dead, a useless black rectangle. She was cut off, isolated, with no way to research or call for help. She would have to walk into the nearby town, the one the bus had bypassed, and start asking questions. The thought filled her with a new kind of anxiety. She would be an outsider, a strange woman with 2 children, asking about a name from a century-old murder confession. It sounded like the ramblings of a madwoman, but what choice did she have? The locket in her pocket felt heavier, its secret both a burden and a source of strength. She carefully propped the painting of the imposter against the wall, facing away from the room. She couldn't bear to look at that face anymore. She then took the brick she had removed from the hearth and carefully placed it back into its cavity, sliding it into place until it looked, once again, like all the others. The secret was hidden again, but now it was hidden with her. She glanced around the room, which was still a scene of decay and neglect, but to her it had been transformed. It was no longer a tomb of despair. It was the starting point. It was where the truth, after 100 years of silence, had finally begun to speak. She felt a grim smile touch her lips for the first time in months. The game had changed. She was no longer a victim of circumstance, waiting for the world to crush her. She was now a player, holding a secret that could change everything. Her gaze fell on her children. Leo looked up from his cleaning, a question in his eyes. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, sensing the shift in her demeanor. She managed a real smile for him, a small but genuine expression of a hope she hadn't felt before. "I'm okay, sweetie," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since his father died. I think I may have found something." She wouldn't tell them about the murder, not yet. They were too young for such darkness, but she would tell them they had a story, a family history that was more important than they could ever imagine. She felt the heavy mantle of despair finally lift from her shoulders, replaced by the weight of a new and dangerous responsibility. She had a name, a map, and a confession. It was more than she'd had in a very long time. As twilight began to fall again, casting long shadows through the single clean window, Ilara did not feel the same terror as the night before. The creaks and groans of the old house no longer sounded like threats. They sounded like whispers, the echoes of a history she was now a part of. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with peril. People who build fortunes on murder do not let them go easily, and their descendants are often cut from the same cloth. The name Croft was now a target on her back, but fear was a familiar companion, and now it was mixed with something new and powerful, a sense of purpose. She was not just fighting for survival anymore, she was fighting for justice, for Liana, and for the future that had been stolen from her family. As she held her children close that night, the cold weight of the locket pressed against her skin, a silent promise that the story of Liana Vance was not over. The brittle parchment felt like a moth's wing in Ilara's calloused fingers. A testament to a century of silence, she sat on the dusty floor, the weak morning light illuminating the spidery, faded ink of Alistair Croft's confession. Each word was a drop of poison, seeping into her understanding of her own life. "Liana," the letter whispered, "was the sun around which our family orbited, and her fortune was a kingdom I craved." Ilara felt a profound and aching grief for this woman with her face, a woman she had never known but was now intrinsically linked to. She could almost see her, vibrant, intelligent, the rightful heir to a coffee empire, a sprawling legacy of lands and wealth that stretched across the horizon. The confession painted a vivid picture not just of a theft, but of an annihilation of a life, a meticulous erasure of a person from history. Ilara felt her own poverty, the gnawing hunger and the terror of eviction, not as a random misfortune, but as the final bitter inheritance of this ancient crime, a ripple of injustice reaching across time to drown her. Alistair's words detailed the conspiracy with a chilling precision that made Ilara's stomach churn. He wrote of his meetings with a disgraced doctor in a city saloon, the clinking of coins sealing Liana's fate. "A woman's mind is a fragile thing," the doctor had falsely testified, his words dripping with patriarchal condescension. "Her passions make her unfit for business." Ilara felt a surge of hot, righteous anger. Liana had been condemned by a world that saw her ambition as hysteria. Then came the impostor, a destitute woman plucked from the gutter, her uncanny resemblance to Liana a cruel twist of fate. Alistair described coaching her, teaching her Liana's mannerisms, her signature, transforming this desperate soul into a puppet. The confession called the impostor a perfect vessel for my ambition, a phrase that made Ilara feel sick. This wasn't just a story of greed, it was a tale of profound violation, of two women destroyed by one man's monstrous ego, their identities stolen and twisted to his own ends. The final lines of the confession were the ones that haunted Ilara's every waking thought. "The real Liana had to be silenced forever," Alistair wrote, the script becoming jagged, almost unhinged. He described a moonless night, the sounds of a carriage on a dirt road, and a secret journey back to this very property. Ilara squeezed her eyes shut, but the images flooded her mind. She could hear the rustle of leaves, smell the damp earth of the woods, feel the cold terror that must have coursed through Liana's veins as she realized she was not being saved, but disposed of. The letter spoke of a burial under a great oak, a final, grotesque insult. Liana was returned to her own land not as its master, but to be consumed by it. Ilara opened her eyes and looked out the grimy window towards the dark tree line. The betrayer's oak was out there. Her ancestors' bones were out there. The locket in her pocket felt impossibly heavy, a cold stone of truth against her skin. The crime wasn't over. It was right here, waiting. It was the sound that came first, an intrusion so alien it felt like a violation, a low, powerful hum, The sound of an expensive, well-tuned engine grew steadily from the direction of the main road. Ilara's head snapped up, her heart instantly beginning to hammer against her ribs. No cars came down this path. The bus driver had made that clear. This was the end of the line, a place forgotten by the modern world. The hum grew into a smooth, confident purr, accompanied by the slow, deliberate crunch of tires on the dry dirt and gravel of the path. It was a sound of wealth, of purpose, of someone who was not lost but had arrived exactly where they intended to be. A cold knot of dread formed in Ilara's stomach. This wasn't a friendly neighbor or a lost traveler. This was something else. A shiver traced its way down her spine. The silence of the ruin had been her sanctuary, and now it was being torn apart by the sound of approaching danger she could not yet see, but felt in her very bones. Through the clean patch of window, she saw it. A sleek, black sedan Equistus polished to a mirror shine that seemed to drink the sunlight, rolled to a stop right where the overgrown path met the clearing. The vehicle was a breathtaking anachronism, a creature of steel and glass from another planet set against the backdrop of the rotting house. It was long, luxurious, and silent now that its engine was off. Its tinted windows were opaque, reflecting the image of the dilapidated porch and the weeds, distorting the ruin into a warped, funhouse version of itself. Ilara felt a primal fear. This car belonged to someone with immense power and money, the kind of money that should have been hers. The name from the confession screamed in her mind, Croft. It had to be. No one else would have a reason to come here. The car just sat there for a long moment, a silent black predator assessing its territory, its presence radiating an aura of cold, patient menace that was far more terrifying than any overt threat could ever be. Panic, sharp and electric, seized Ilara. "Leo! Mia! Inside, now! Be quiet!" she hissed, her voice a choked whisper. She shoved the locket deep into her pocket, the metal cold against her thigh. Her mind raced. The confession, the map, the painting, all of it evidence. She grabbed her children, who looked at her with wide, frightened eyes, and hurried them into the darkest corner of the back room, a small pantry thick with the smell of dust and decay. "Don't make a sound. No matter what you hear, you stay here," she commanded, her voice trembling but firm. She felt her heart pounding in her ears, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She had to face this person alone. She couldn't show weakness. She couldn't show fear. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to calm the storm inside her. Then she heard it. The solid-eyed definitive thud of a car door closing. Footsteps. Slow, measured, confident steps crunching on the dry leaves and twigs leading up to the sagging porch. They were coming. He was here. The man who appeared in the doorway was framed by the rotting wood, like a portrait from another world. He was elderly, perhaps in his late 70s, but he stood ramrod straight, radiating an aura of unyielding authority. He was dressed in an immaculately tailored dark grey suit that likely cost more than Ilara had ever earned in a year. His shoes, gleaming black leather, looked absurdly out of place on the dusty, broken floorboards of the porch. His hair was a perfect mane of silver, and his face was a mask of aristocratic lines and deep-set, intelligent eyes. But it was those eyes that made Ilara's blood run cold. They were the color of a winter sky, pale, clear, and utterly devoid of warmth. They swept over the squalid room, taking in the shrouded furniture, the water stains, and Ilara herself, with a look of detached, dismissive appraisal. He held out a hand, his movements smooth and economical. "Mr. Silas Croft," he announced, his voice a low, cultured baritone that carried easily in the silent room. "I own the surrounding lands." Ilara felt a jolt, as if she had touched a live wire. Silas Croft, the great-grandson of the murderer and the imposter. He was real, he was here. She stared at his outstretched hand, her mind screaming. This hand was connected to a legacy of theft and murder, a dynasty built on her ancestors' stolen fortune. The urge to recoil was so strong it was a physical force, but she fought it down. Showing fear would be a fatal mistake. She wiped her dusty palm on her jeans and took his hand. His grip was firm, dry, and cool. The skin surprisingly smooth for a man his age. It was a hand that had never known a day of hard labor. It held hers for a fraction of a second too long, a subtle act of dominance. He gave a thin, humorless smile. "I was informed a descendant had taken up residence," he said, his cold eyes scanning her face with an unnerving intensity. "The family resemblance is quite remarkable." The words hung in the air, a veiled acknowledgement of the secret that lay between them. And Ilara felt a chill of pure dread. He didn't wait for an invitation. Silas Croft stepped past her into the room, his expensive shoes making soft, deliberate sounds on the dusty floorboards. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who believes the world belongs to him. He ran a gloved finger along a filthy mantelpiece, then inspected the grey smudge on the white leather with an expression of faint disgust. "Quite the ruin, isn't it?" he mused, his voice dripping with condescension. "A relic of a forgotten time. Frankly, it's a blight on the landscape, and a dangerous one at that." He gestured vaguely at the collapsed portion of the roof. "Structural integrity is non-existent. The whole thing could come down in a strong wind." He walked over to the single clean window, his back to her. "I heard about your husband. My condolences. It must be very difficult for you, being left in this position, with children." "Toles." The feigned sympathy was more insulting than open contempt. Ilara felt her hands clench into tight fists at her sides, her fingernails digging into her palms. He turned back to face her, his expression shifting from feigned pity to brisk business. The mask was off. "Let's not waste one another's time, Mrs. Vance. This property is worthless, the land is fallow, and the house, as you can see, is a liability. It would cost a fortune to demolish. More than the plot is worth." He paused, letting the weight of his pronouncement settle in the dusty air. Ilara's heart pounded. She knew what was coming. She braced herself, her entire body rigid with tension. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a slim leather checkbook and a gold fountain pen. The items looked like sacred artifacts in the squalor of the room. "However," he continued, his voice smooth as silk, "I am a sentimental man. My family has history in this region. For the sake of that history, and to help you out of your unfortunate situation, I am prepared to make you an offer, to take this burden off your hands." He clicked the pen. $10,000. Cashier's check. You sign the deed and you can be on a bus out of here this afternoon. $10,000. The number hung in the air, a stunning, calculated insult. Just a month ago, that sum would have felt like a king's ransom. The answer to all her prayers. It would have paid off their debts, secured a new apartment, and fed her children for a year. It was a lifeline. But now, knowing what she knew, it was a pittance. It was hush money. It was the price he was putting on her ancestor's life, on a stolen coffee empire worth millions. A white-hot rage, pure and cleansing, surged through Ilara, momentarily burning away her fear. He was trying to buy her silence, to buy her off as cheaply as his great-grandfather had bought a corrupt doctor. He saw her not as the rightful heir, but as a problem to be managed, a piece of trash to be paid off and swept away. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it stole her breath. She could feel the blood pounding in her temples, a roaring in her ears that almost drowned out the sound of his pen scratching on the check. He was signing it, assuming her consent. She found her voice, and was surprised to find it steady, though it felt like it was being dragged over broken glass. "No," she said. The single word dropped into the silence like a stone. It was quiet, but it was absolute. Silas Croft froze, the pen hovering over the check. He slowly looked up at her, his pale eyes narrowing. The thin veneer of civility evaporated, revealing the cold, hard predator beneath. For a moment, he simply stared at her, and in his gaze she saw a flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by a flash of raw, undisguised fury. He had not expected this. He had expected a grateful, desperate widow to snatch the money and run. He had miscalculated. The smile on his face vanished completely, replaced by a tight, bloodless line. He slowly, deliberately, capped his gold pen and slipped it back into his pocket, along with the checkbook. The amiable act was over. The air in the room grew thick and cold, heavy with a new and palpable menace. He took a step closer to her, his shadow falling over her. "A mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that was no longer cultured, but guttural. "You are making a very foolish mistake." His eyes flickered around the decaying room, his gaze lingering on the crumbling fireplace, the frayed, ancient wiring visible where plaster had fallen away. "Old houses like this," he said, his voice a venomous purr. "They are full of dangers. Faulty wiring, dry, brittle wood. They are tinderboxes, really." He looked directly into her eyes, and there was no mistaking the message. Fires can start so easily. A stray spark in the night. A tragic accident. The authorities find it happens all the time in these abandoned places, especially when squatters are involved. He let the threat hang in the air. A promise of violence so clear it was like a physical blow. Ilara felt a wave of pure terror wash over her, so cold and intense it made her feel faint. He was threatening to burn the house down, with her and her children inside it. He held her gaze for another long, chilling moment, a silent battle of wills. Ilara refused to look away, her defiance fueled by a terror-stricken maternal instinct. He was threatening her children. The thought gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. Finally, a small, cruel smile touched the corner of his lips. It was a victor's smile. He had delivered his message. He turned without another word and walked out of the house, his footsteps once again confident and measured on the rotting porch. Ilara stood frozen, listening to his steps fade, followed by the solid thud of the car door. The engine purred to life, and the sound of the tires crunching on the dirt path receded until it was gone, leaving a silence that was now deeper and more terrifying than before. He had left, but his presence lingered like a poison in the air, a chilling promise of what he was capable of. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 minutes, but Ilara knew her life, and the lives of her children, had been irrevocably altered. She remained frozen for a full minute, her body trembling, her mind reeling from the encounter. The $10,000 he had offered was a path to safety, a way out. She could take the money, disappear, and try to build a new life somewhere far away from the name Croft. She could protect her children from the danger that now loomed over them like a hawk, but to do so would be to let him win. It would mean letting Liana's murder remain a secret, letting a dynasty built on blood continue to thrive. It would mean surrendering her own birthright for a handful of silver. The locket in her pocket felt both like a condemnation and a call to arms. The path of justice was a path directly into the fire he had promised. It meant staying, fighting a man with limitless resources and no conscience. It meant putting her children in the line of fire. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money and run to guarantee your children's safety, or would you risk everything to fight for the justice your family deserved? The chilling echo of Silas Croft's threat lingered in the air, a venom that poisoned the very silence of the house. Ilara's fear was a physical thing, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. But beneath the terror, a new and unfamiliar hardness was forming. He had not just threatened her, he had threatened her children. That single, unforgivable act had cauterized her despair, transforming it into a blade of pure and cold resolve. She would not run. Running was what he wanted. She would fight, but she couldn't fight a ghost. She needed more than a century-old confession. She needed to understand the enemy she was facing now. The name Croft had to mean something in this forgotten corner of the world. Leaving Leo and Mia hidden in the most secure corner of the house with a solemn promise to return, she set out for the town. A 2-mile walk under a sun that felt hostile and watchful. The locket and the confession felt like a burning coal in her pocket, a secret that could either save her or get her killed. Every rustle of leaves in the oppressive woods sounded like footsteps, every bird call like a warning. The town, when she finally reached it, felt like a place caught in amber. It was a single main street of tired-looking storefronts, their paint peeling, their windows dusty, a general store, a boarded-up movie theater, and a grim-looking bar seemed to be the only signs of life. The few people she saw on the sidewalks moved slowly, their shoulders stooped, their gazes downcast. They glanced at her, an outsider, with a fleeting, weary curiosity before looking away. Ilara felt an invisible weight pressing down on the entire town, a silent, pervasive influence. It was the same atmosphere of decay and resignation she felt in her own ruin, just on a larger scale. This was Croft territory. She could feel his ownership in the very air, in the quiet deference of the people, in the lack of hope that seemed to stain the buildings like mildew. Her heart sank. How could she possibly find an ally here? This town wasn't just isolated. It felt captive, its spirit long since broken by the wealthy family that loomed over it like a storm cloud. She felt profoundly and dangerously alone. Her destination was a small, unassuming brick building at the far end of the street, a tarnished brass plaque next to the door reading County Library. It seemed almost as neglected as her inherited house, with weeds cracking the front steps and a film of grime obscuring the tall windows. She pushed open the heavy oak door, a small bell above it giving a weak, dusty jingle. The air that greeted her was a welcome relief from the oppressive heat, and it carried a scent she had always loved, the dry, sweet perfume of old paper, leather and wood polish. The silence inside was profound, a sacred quiet that absorbed the sounds of the outside world. Sunlight streamed in through the dirty windows in thick, hazy shafts, illuminating galaxies of dancing dust motes. Rows of tall, dark bookshelves stretched into the gloom, creating narrow canyons of knowledge. For the first time since arriving in this desolate region, Ilara felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a scholar's silence, a silence of preservation. It felt safe. In the center of the room, seated at a massive wooden desk piled high with teetering stacks of books and papers, was a man who seemed as ancient as the library itself. He was hunched over a large open ledger, a magnifying glass in one hand, his posture a permanent question mark. A threadbare, mustard-colored cardigan was draped over his bony shoulders, its elbows worn to a shine. His remaining hair was a wispy white halo around a bald, freckled scalp. As Ilara approached, the floorboards creaking softly under her feet, he didn't look up. His entire being focused on the script before him. She could hear the faint scratch of a pen as he made a note in a margin. Ink stains, faded and fresh, colored the tips of his long, gnarled fingers. He looked like a man who had not just worked in this library his whole life, but had grown from its very floor. A creature of paper and dust, he radiated an aura of intense, almost hostile concentration, and Ilara's courage nearly failed her. This was the man she had to interrupt, her only hope. She cleared her throat, the small sound seeming like a cannon blast in the tomb-like quiet. "Excuse me?" The man flinched, startled, and finally looked up. His eyes, magnified to a startling size by a pair of thick, round spectacles, blinked at her. They were a pale, watery blue, and they held an expression of profound annoyance, as if she were a fly buzzing at his ear. "The library is for quiet study," he rasped, his voice dry and crackling like old parchment. Ilara's heart sank. She pressed on, her own voice barely a whisper. "I'm sorry to bother you. I'm looking for some historical information about a local family." The librarian, Mr. Abel, as a small nameplate on the desk indicated, sighed with theatrical impatience. He placed his magnifying glass down with a weary finality. "All our public records are indexed in the card catalogue," he said, gesturing vaguely toward a corner. "If it isn't there, I can't help you." He was already turning back to his ledger, a clear, sharp dismissal. He was a wall she had to find a way through. Desperation made her bold. "It's about the Croft family," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. At the name, Abel froze. He didn't look up, but she saw his shoulders tense beneath the worn cardigan. A long, heavy silence stretched between them, filled only by the ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower and laced with something that sounded like a warning. "The Crofts are the history of this county," he said, still not looking at her. "They built everything here. They own everything here. Some history is best left on the shelves." "Ta, young lady." The message was clear. "Don't dig." She felt a cold wave of despair wash over her. He was afraid. Even here, in this sanctuary of knowledge, the fear of Silas Croft was a palpable force. If this man, this guardian of history, was too scared to even speak the name, what hope did she have? She was about to turn and leave, her shoulders slumping in defeat, when she decided to play her final, desperate card. "I need to know about Liana Vance," she said, the name leaving her lips as a quiet plea. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. Abel's head snapped up, his glasses slipping down his nose. He stared at her, truly stared at her, for the first time. His watery blue eyes widened, the annoyance gone, replaced by a look of stunned, utter disbelief. His gaze darted from her eyes to her cheekbones to her hairline, a silent, frantic inventory of her features. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He slowly, deliberately took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes with a trembling hand, as if trying to wipe away an apparition. Liana, he whispered, the name a fragile, sacred thing in the dusty air. My God, he breathed, his gaze fixed on her face. It's true, the resemblance. After all these years. He stood up, his movements stiff and unsteady, and beckoned to her with a trembling finger. Come with me, he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. Quickly in the back. Mr. Abel led her through a narrow doorway behind his desk, into a small, windowless room she hadn't seen. It was an archive, even more densely packed than the main library. The air was thick with the scent of aging paper and leather binders' glue. Floor-to-ceiling shelves were crammed with enormous, dusty ledgers, rolled-up maps tied with faded ribbon, and dozens of identical grey archival boxes. My grandfather was the county clerk. When Alistair Croft filed his claim, Abel began, his voice a low, conspiratorial murmur. He knew it was wrong. He knew Liana. She was sharp as a tack, not a hysterical bone in her body. But Alistair had the doctor, the judge in his pocket. My grandfather had no power to stop it. He ran a reverent hand over the spine of a ledger. But he couldn't bring himself to destroy the original records. He started a tradition, a secret. The Abel family became the unofficial guardians of the truth, waiting for a day of reckoning. Waiting, he said, turning to look her straight in the eye, for a true descendant to return. He pulled a heavy metal strongbox from a low shelf, the sound of it scraping on the wood echoing in the small, tight space. It was old, rusted at the hinges, and locked with a heavy padlock. He produced a small, ornate iron key from a chain around his neck and unlocked it. The click of the lock was deafening. He lifted the heavy lid, revealing a small collection of documents, carefully wrapped in oilcloth. Ilara felt her breath catch in her throat. This was it, the other half of the story. Alistair was meticulous in creating his lie, Abel explained, his voice trembling with a lifetime of suppressed indignation. He had new papers drawn up for his imposter wife, a new birth certificate, a new identity. He ordered the originals destroyed, but my grandfather made copies. He carefully unwrapped the oilcloth, his gnarled fingers surprisingly nimble. The documents within were yellowed and fragile, but the ink was clear and dark. He was handing her the ammunition she needed for a war. This changed everything, with a reverence bordering on worship. Abel laid the documents out on a small, cluttered table. This, he said, pointing to the first paper, is Liana Vance's original birth certificate. It lists her parents, the original plantation owners. It proves your direct lineage. He then pointed to a small stack of letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon. And these are the real treasures, letters Liana wrote to her lawyer just weeks before she was committed. She was questioning Alistair's handling of the estate finances. She accused him of embezzlement. This is the proof of her sanity. This is the motive. Ilara stared at the papers, her mind reeling. The locket held the confession. These papers proved the crime. Finally, Abel's face grew grim. You must understand, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Silas is his great-grandfather reborn, but more ruthless. He knows these loose ends exist. He spent the last 40 years buying out every other branch of the family, every last person with a historical claim, silencing them with money or fear. You, Ilara, are the last one, the final threat to his stolen empire. The weight of the new documents in her bag felt immense as she walked back towards the ruin. Abel's words echoed in her mind, a litany of warnings. The last family who refused to sell, their barn burned down. A tragic accident, the sheriff said. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in angry strokes of orange and purple. The woods no longer felt merely watchful, they felt actively hostile, the long shadows of the trees like grasping fingers. Every snapped twig under her feet sounded like a footstep behind her. The knowledge that she was the final threat had transformed her fear from a dull ache into a sharp, piercing panic. She was no longer just a woman who had stumbled upon a secret. She was the sole impediment to a century of lies, a direct threat to a man who burned down barns to get his way. She clutched the bag of documents to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was a mouse carrying a bomb, walking straight back into the lion's den. She had to get her children and run. The sight of the house as she emerged from the trees sent a fresh wave of terror through her. The dilapidated structure, silhouetted against the blood-red sunset, looked like a skull. It was a death trap, Silas Croft's threat about fires, about tragic accidents, was no longer a veiled insinuation. It was a clear and present promise. She burst through the door, her voice a choked whisper. "Leo! Mia!" They emerged from their hiding place, their faces pale and frightened by her obvious panic. She hugged them fiercely, the solid warmth of their small bodies a temporary anchor in her sea of fear. "We have to be ready to leave," she told them, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're going to play a game, a quiet game." She had to form a plan. The car was gone, the bus stop miles away. They were trapped. Her eyes, frantic and searching, fell upon the map clutched in her hand, the map from the locket. Her gaze drifted past the ominous X of the betrayer's oak and focused on the sketch of the house itself. She saw something she had overlooked in her initial shock. It was a thin, dotted line, emerging from the area marked cellar and snaking its way out into the woods behind the house. Next to it, two small words were written in Alistair's spidery script: "Servants, tunnel." A surge of adrenaline, a desperate, electric hope shot through her. An escape route, a secret way out, built by the very family that had been destroyed, waiting for a century to be used. It was their only chance. "Stay here and be silent," she commanded her children, her voice now sharp with a singular purpose. She grabbed the nearly dead phone, its flashlight function her only weapon against the darkness, and descended the rickety steps into the cellar. The air hit her like a physical blow, cold and heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, rot, and something else, the smell of utter hopelessness. The weak beam of the phone's light cut a nervous, dancing circle through the oppressive blackness, revealing stone walls slick with moisture and a floor of packed, cold dirt. This was the belly of the beast. The phone's light flickered, a dying star in the subterranean gloom. Ilara swept the beam across the darkness, revealing the detritus of 100 years of neglect. Rotting barrels, their staves crumbling. Leaned against the walls, ghostly white fungus grew in sprawling patterns on damp wooden shelves. The silence was absolute, a pressing weight on her eardrums. In the far corner, behind a stack of what looked like old, collapsed potato crates, the stone pattern seemed to change. Her heart hammered. She scrambled over debris, her shoes sinking into the soft dirt. The beam revealed a low, arched opening in the foundation, exactly where the map had indicated it would be. But her hope immediately curdled into despair. It was blocked. Thick, heavy planks of oak, grey with age and studded with rusted nails, had been hammered across the opening. It wasn't a door. It was a seal, meant to be permanent. She pushed against the wood with all her might. It didn't budge. It was as solid as the stone around it. Tears of frustration and terror stung her eyes. She sagged against the cold, unyielding wood, her body trembling with exhausted despair. Trapped? They were trapped. The phone light flickered again, more violently this time, and she knew she only had seconds of power left. And then she heard it, a sound from directly above. It wasn't the familiar groan of the old house settling. It was a sharp, deliberate thud on the porch, followed by the crunch of heavy boots on the living room floorboards. They weren't even trying to be quiet. Her blood turned to ice. She instantly thumbed the phone's light off, plunging the cellar into absolute, terrifying blackness. She held her breath, straining to listen. The silence was broken only by the frantic, silent screaming of her own pulse in her ears. She heard the scrape of something being dragged across the floor above, then the low murmur of voices, male voices. They were in the house. Croft hadn't waited. He had sent his men. He was making good on his promise. Tonight. Now. Just as that terrifying realization hit her. A sound so jarring and loud it made her cry out tore through the cellar. Her phone was ringing. The shrill electronic noise was a shriek in the sepulchral silence, a beacon announcing her presence. Panic seized her as she fumbled in the dark, her hands shaking too badly to answer it. The ringing stopped, then started again. It was Abel. It had to be. Finally, her trembling fingers found the button. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "Ilara!" Abel's voice was a frantic, breathless hiss crackling with static. "He knows you came to see me. Someone in town told him. I saw them. I saw two of his men leaving town in a pickup truck, not 10 minutes ago. They were carrying gasoline cans, Ilara. Do you hear me? Gasoline. They're coming to burn the house down. Get your children and get out of there. Get out now." The warning was a death sentence. As he spoke, she heard the definitive, splintering crash of the front door being kicked in right above her head, followed by the confident stride of heavy boots. The phone in her hand went dead. The battery was gone. The line to the outside world was cut. She was alone in the suffocating darkness, listening to the movements of the men who had come to kill her and her children. They were directly overhead now, their footsteps echoing on the weak floorboards. Then, a new smell drifted down through the cracks, sharp and chemical, instantly identifiable and utterly terrifying. Gasoline. It was a sickeningly sweet, acrid odor that stung the back of her throat and made her stomach heave. They were pouring it everywhere. She could hear the liquid sloshing from cans, the sound of it splashing onto the dry wood and dusty floors. A wave of nausea and pure, primal terror washed over her. "Make sure you get the stairs," one of the voices growled. The sound muffled, but the menace perfectly clear. "The boss wants it to go up fast. He wants nothing left. Nothing and no one." They knew she was here. This wasn't just about destroying evidence. This was an execution. A ferocious, maternal rage burned through Ilara's terror. They would not have her children. She would not let them die in this tomb. She scrambled back towards the cellar steps, her eyes useless in the pitch black, her hands guiding her along the cold stone wall. She moved with a desperate, silent speed, her mind screaming. She found the stairs and flew up them, emerging into the relative gloom of the kitchen. She saw them through the doorway, two large, shadowy figures moving through the living room. She didn't wait. She snatched Leo and Mia from their hiding spot, the terror in their eyes a physical blow to her heart. Mia started to let out a whimper, and Ilara clamped a hand gently over her mouth. "Not a sound," she breathed into her daughter's ear, her voice a prayer. "We have to be quieter than shadows. Your lives depend on it." Leo, his face a pale mask of bravery, simply nodded, his small hand gripping hers like a vice. She had to get them to the tunnel. It was the only way. It was the impossible way. She half pushed, half carried her children back towards the cellar, her every sense screaming. The fumes of gasoline were overpowering now, a thick, suffocating cloud that made her eyes water and her head swim. The air was shimmering with it. She could hear the men's casual conversation as they worked, their voices calm, as if they were performing a routine chore. The banality of their evil was the most horrifying thing of all. As she reached the top of the cellar stairs, one of the men flicked a lighter. The sharp, metallic click echoed in the house. A small flame bloomed in the living room, casting their monstrous shadows against the wall. They were admiring their work. "That should do it," one of them chuckled. "Let's go." Ilara shoved her children down the steps ahead of her and tumbled into the blackness of the cellar just as she heard their heavy boots retreating across the porch. A terrifying, momentary silence descended upon the house, a held breath before the world ended. Back in the suffocating darkness of the cellar, the gasoline fumes were so thick she could taste them. The tunnel, it was everything. She groped in the dark, her hands sweeping across the cold dirt floor, searching for a tool, a weapon, anything. Her fingers closed around a length of cold, heavy iron, a rusted section of old pipe. It was heavy, but it would have to do. Adrenaline, pure and potent, coursed through her veins, giving her a strength she had never known. She wedged the end of the pipe into the crack she had made earlier, between the thick oak planks and the stone archway. "Stay behind me," she grunted to her children, who were huddled together, their frightened sobs muffled against each other. She put her entire weight on the pipe, using it as a lever. The metal groaned. The old wood creaked in protest, but it held. She grunted, sweat and tears of terror stinging her eyes, her muscles screaming. The pipe slipped, slamming her against the wall. For a terrifying second, she thought it was hopeless. The rage at her own helplessness surged, and she tried again. She jammed the pipe back in, deeper this time, and threw her entire body into the effort. There was a loud, splintering crack that echoed in the small space. A jolt of savage triumph shot through her. A board had split. Above, she heard the men's voices, farther away now. One of them shouted, "Ready?" She worked with frantic, desperate energy, leveraging the pipe, prying, pushing. The wood was a century old, but it had been set by men who built things to last. It fought her for every inch. She could hear the men laughing outside, the sound carefree and cruel. She slammed the pipe against the boards again and again, the rhythmic thud the only sound in the cellar besides her own ragged breathing. Another board cracked, then another. The opening was still too small. She needed to break one completely free. "Light it up!" a voice yelled from outside. A split second of silence followed, a void of pure dread. She knew what was coming next. The world was about to catch fire. She gave one final desperate heave. With a sound like a gunshot, the main plank shattered, breaking free from the rusted nails. A sliver of hope in the darkness. Just then, she heard the truck engine roar to life outside. They were leaving, but it wasn't over. She pried at the broken board, tearing her hands on the splintered wood, pulling it free from the opening. There was now a gap, barely big enough to crawl through. She was about to shove Leo towards it when the world outside the cellar door erupted. It wasn't a sound so much as a pressure change, a deep, hungry whoomph that vibrated through the stone walls and the dirt floor. A monstrous, orange light pulsed down the cellar stairs, instantly illuminating the space in a terrifying, flickering glow. The heat was immediate and intense, like the opening of a blast furnace. The fire had been lit. The house was now a bomb that had just been armed and was about to detonate. The race was no longer against the men, it was against the flames. "Go, go now," she screamed, shoving Leo toward the dark, narrow opening. He didn't hesitate, scrambling into the blackness of the tunnel. Mia followed right behind him, her small body disappearing into the earth. The roar of the fire above was growing, a monstrous, living thing, punctuated by the sharp crackle of ancient wood catching flame and the pop of glass shattering in the heat. Smoke, thick and black and choking, began to billow down the cellar stairs, filling the space with a blinding, acrid fog. Elara took one last look at the inferno above, then scrambled into the tunnel after her children. Clutching the precious bundle of documents to her chest, she pulled a piece of the broken plank over the opening behind her, a futile gesture that nonetheless felt necessary, sealing them into the cool, damp darkness of the earth as the house above them was consumed by a hell of Silas Croft's making. The sound of the fire was a deafening, terrifying roar just on the other side of the stone. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. It was a narrow, crudely dug passage, the ceiling so low they had to crawl on their hands and knees. The air was cool but stagnant, smelling of damp soil, worms, and a century of stillness. It was absolute blackness, a void so complete that Elara couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. She kept one hand on Mia's ankle in front of her, the other clutching the documents and the locket. The ground was cold and wet, mud soaking through the knees of her jeans. Behind them, the muffled roar of the fire was a constant, terrifying reminder of the death they had so narrowly escaped. She could feel the vibrations through the ground. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a terrifying, lightless journey into the unknown. Panic clawed at the edges of her mind, the fear of being buried alive, but she pushed it down, focusing only on the small, warm ankle in her hand. "Keep going," she whispered, her voice hoarse from smoke. "We're almost there." After what felt like an eternity of crawling through the cold, suffocating dark, she felt a change in the air. A faint, cool breeze touched her face, a hint of fresh air, smelling of pine needles and night. Hope surged through her. A few feet further, the tunnel opened up. Leo had already scrambled out and was pulling his sister after him. Elara crawled the last few feet and emerged from the tunnel's mouth, which was hidden in a thicket of overgrown bushes and ferns, 100 yards into the woods behind the house. She stumbled to her feet, gasping in the clean, cool night air, her lungs burning. She turned and looked back. Her children were huddled beside her, their faces streaked with soot and tears, staring in silent horror at the spectacle before them. They were safe. They were out. She pulled them into a fierce embrace, her body trembling with the aftershocks of terror and the savage joy of their survival. She had gotten them out. She had won. The house was no longer a house. It was a raging column of fire, a colossal, roaring torch that painted the night sky in brilliant, terrible shades of orange and red. Flames, hundreds of feet high, clawed at the stars, consuming the last century of decay in a matter of minutes. The entire structure was a writhing, skeletal inferno, its frame starkly visible against the blaze. The sound was a deafening, continuous roar, the sound of a world being unmade. As they watched, the main part of the roof finally gave way, collapsing inward with a great shower of sparks and embers that rained down like hellish snow. The heat was a physical force, even from this distance, warming her face. Ilara clutched the documents Abel had given her and the locket from the hearth, the papers warm against her skin. She watched the symbol of her despair, the ruin that had brought her to her knees, burn to the ground. This was not the end he had planned. He had meant to erase her, but all he had done was forge her into a weapon. This fire wasn't her execution. It was a declaration of war. They stumbled through the woods, a trio of ghosts illuminated by the distant, dying pyre of their past. The oppressive darkness of the forest was a different kind of threat now. No longer hiding a monster but shielding them from one, Ilara held her children's hands, their small fingers cold and trembling in hers. The acrid smell of smoke clung to their hair and clothes, a phantom of the inferno they had escaped. Every branch that snagged her jacket, every rustle of an unseen creature in the undergrowth, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through her. She clutched the precious packet of documents to her chest. It was no longer just paper, but the condensed weight of a life, a crime, and her only weapon. The path to Abel's library was a pilgrimage through a landscape of fear, each step taking them further from the ashes of their despair and closer to an unknown, terrifying dawn. Her focus was singular, a mantra in her mind: get to Abel, protect the truth, protect her children. The night was cold, but a fire of righteous fury burned within her, a blaze that no man could extinguish. The faint, dusty light in the library window was a lighthouse in a sea of rural darkness. Ilara practically fell through the door, her children collapsing into a small, shivering heap at her feet. Abel was there, his face a pale, ravaged mask of worry. He rushed forward, his annoyance from before completely gone, replaced by a frantic, protective energy. He wrapped the children in thick wool blankets from a dusty chest, his gnarled hands surprisingly gentle, as he offered them a glass of water, which they drank greedily. His watery eyes met Ilara's over their heads, and in his gaze she saw the shared horror and a lifetime of vindication coming to a head. He looked at the soot on her face, the wild terror in her eyes, and the precious bundle of papers she clutched as if it were a vital organ. "He did it," Abel whispered, his voice cracking with a mixture of fury and awe. "So the monster actually did it." Ilara could only nod, the words caught in her throat. She was safe, for now. The sanctuary of knowledge had become a fortress against the encroaching darkness. Abel didn't hesitate. He moved with a purpose that belied his age, bypassing the local phone and retrieving an older, more secure line from his back office. He didn't dial the county sheriff. He dialed a long-distance number from a small, worn black book. Ilara listened, her heart pounding, as he spoke to a woman he called Prosecutor Dixon. His voice was no longer the dry rasp of a librarian, but the firm, clear tone of a key witness. "Dixon, it's Abel. It's happened. Arson at the old Vance property, and attempted murder. The descendant, Ilara Vance, and her 2 children are with me. They barely escaped." There was a pause. Ilara could imagine the prosecutor's skepticism. "No," Abel said, his voice rising with intensity. "This time is different. She found it. The confession, Alistair Croft's full confession, hidden in the house. I have her great-grandmother Liana's original birth certificate and her letters right here. It's everything, Dixon. It's the whole damned thing." Another pause, longer this time. Then Abel's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Yes," he said, "we will be here." The sun rose, casting a grey, tentative light on the world outside. For Ilara, it was the dawn of a new era, though she didn't know if it would be one of justice or retribution. Leo and Mia were asleep on a makeshift bed of old coats in the archive room, their faces finally peaceful in the slumber of pure exhaustion. Ilara sat across from Abel at his massive desk, the silence between them thick with unspoken history and palpable tension. The locket lay on the desk between them, alongside Liana's birth certificate. The object seemed to hum with a latent energy, the physical manifestation of a 100-year-old secret. Ilara traced the name Liana Vance with her finger. She felt an overwhelming connection to the woman she had never met, the ghost with her face. This fight was no longer just for her own future, but for the past, for the name and the life that had been so brutally stolen. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a vessel for Liana's deferred justice, the last link in a chain that refused to be broken. The crunch of tires on gravel announced their arrival. But these were not the smooth, predatory sounds of a luxury sedan. This was the sound of authority. 3 unmarked state cruisers pulling up in front of the library with decisive finality. A woman in a sharp, dark pantsuit emerged from the lead car, her movements crisp and efficient. This was Prosecutor Dixon. Her eyes were intelligent and missed nothing, and as she looked at Ilara, there was no pity, only a grim, professional respect. Ilara recounted the story, her voice starting as a tremble but growing stronger as she spoke, fueled by the memory of the fire and of Silas Croft's cold threat. She presented the evidence one piece at a time: the tarnished locket, the brittle confession, the crude map, and Abel's painstakingly preserved documents. Prosecutor Dixon examined each item under a portable lamp, her expression hardening with each new revelation. "Mr. Croft made 2 mistakes," she said, her voice like flint. "He underestimated you, and he underestimated Mr. Abel. The convoy didn't announce itself at the gates of the Croft estate. It rolled up the long, manicured driveway with a quiet, menacing purpose. The mansion was a monument to stolen wealth, its white columns gleaming in the morning sun. Silas Croft was likely in his study, sipping his morning coffee, believing his problem had been incinerated in the night. The officers, led by Prosecutor Dixon, entered the house without resistance. They found him by his grand mahogany desk, a portrait of the imposter great-grandmother hanging on the wall behind him. The shock on his face was a fleeting, magnificent thing to imagine, the mask of aristocratic invincibility shattering into 1,000 pieces. When the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, the sound was the final punctuation on a century-long sentence. "Silas Croft," Dixon's voice would have been calm and clear, "you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, arson, and insurance fraud." The great man, the titan of the county, was made small, his legacy of fear ending not with a bang, but with a quiet click. The news broke like a dam. The arrest of Silas Croft sent shockwaves through the region and the financial world. The story had everything: a historical murder, a stolen identity, a vast fortune, and a final, fiery confrontation. Following the map from the locket, investigators unearthed the ground beneath the ancient Betrayer's Oak. They found what was left of Liana Vance, the last grim proof of Alistair's confession. The combination of the confession, Abel's meticulously preserved documents, the forensic evidence, and Ilara's own harrowing testimony was an insurmountable mountain of proof. The Croft coffee empire, built on a foundation of blood and lies, began to collapse. In a landmark ruling, the court declared Alistair Croft's entire claim to the Vance estate and all its subsequent profits and holdings to have been fraudulent from its inception. The century-old lie was officially and finally undone. The name Vance was resurrected from the ashes of history, polished and restored to its rightful place. Ilara stood in a courtroom, not as a victim or a squatter, but as the central figure in a story of historical significance. The judge's voice was a low, steady drone, but she heard only a few key phrases: irrefutable evidence, a travesty of justice, and restitution. The final fall of the gavel echoed like a thunderclap, a sound that shook her to her core. The court officially voided Alistair's claim. As Liana Vance's last living direct descendant, she, Ilara Vance, was declared the sole and rightful heir to the entire fortune. The lands, the coffee empire, the vast financial holdings, it was all hers. A lawyer whispered a number in her ear, a figure with so many zeros it seemed like a fantasy. She felt a dizzying wave of vertigo, her mind flashing back to the pathetic pile of coins on her kitchen table, $150. The gulf between that moment and this one was so vast, so profound, it was almost too much to comprehend. She clutched the locket in her hand and felt a sense of profound peace. The debt had been paid. Justice, for Liana, was finally done. Months later, the world was a different color. The oppressive gray of poverty had been replaced by the warm, golden light of a sun-filled afternoon. Ilara sat in a spacious sewing room, the gentle hum of a brand-new, top-of-the-line sewing machine a soothing melody. The scent in the air was not of mold and dust, but of fresh-cut flowers from her own garden and the rich aroma of baking bread. She was not mending worn-out rags to stave off the cold. She was guiding a piece of brilliant sapphire blue silk under the needle, the fabric flowing like water through her fingers. She was crafting a beautiful party dress for Mia, just because she could. Through the large picture window, she could see her children, Leo and Mia, their faces rosy and full, their laughter carrying on the breeze as they chased a ball across an endless expanse of lush green lawn. The gnawing ache of hunger, a feeling that had become a part of her, was a distant memory. The constant, crushing weight of fear had been lifted from her soul, leaving behind a lightness she hadn't felt in years. The dinner table was a portrait of abundance. A golden brown roast chicken sat in the center, surrounded by bowls of steaming mashed potatoes, fresh green beans, and warm, crusty bread. The scene was a universe away from the nights of shared crusts and the lie of, "I'm not hungry." Mia and Leo ate with the unrestrained joy of children who know without a doubt that there will always be another meal. Ilara watched them, her heart swelling with a love and gratitude so intense it was a physical ache. It wasn't the mansion or the number in her bank account that defined her new reality. It was this table, this food, this safety. It was the simple, profound peace of knowing her children were secure, their futures bright and unburdened by the ghosts of the past. She had not just reclaimed a fortune, she had reclaimed her family's dignity. If you were moved by Ilara's journey from the depths of despair to triumphant justice, and you believe in the power of truth to overcome even the darkest of secrets, please subscribe to our channel for more stories of mystery and redemption.